Everybody, welcome to today's webinar. We are going to get started here in just a moment or two, just so that we can give a couple extra people some time to get signed in and set up. But I already saw a couple people are ahead of the game. I would love for you to throw in that chat on the right-hand side where you are joining us from. I can already see we have people from all over the world joining us from, I've seen Quebec, New York, another Cincinnati, Ohio. That's where I am at currently. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening from everyone joining us all over. But please feel free to keep throwing that into the chat here, and we will get started in just a moment.
Hey, Laura.
Hi, Chris. He's my other Cincinnati, Ohio location. So if anyone else is in the good old state of Ohio, let us know. We love seeing. We have Ireland, the UK, India. Welcome, everyone. Wonderful. Well, it looks like we have a few attendees with us currently. So I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on key considerations for implementing post-market clinical medical devices. My name is Laura Court. I'm the Solutions Engineer here at Green Lake Guru, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. Today's session will run for about 60 minutes, but we might stretch more depending on the amount of questions that we get. If you're new to our webinars, let me give you a short walkthrough on the interface. On the right-hand side of your screen, you're going to see a few tabs. The first one is the chat tab that we were just working with, where you can engage with other attendees and post general comments. The Q&A tab is where you can ask questions that you want our presenters to answer during the Q&A portion at the end of today's webinar. We'll share the full recording and slides with all registrants after the webinar, so keep an eye out for an email from us in the next coming few days. Let me go ahead and get my slides switched over here, just so I don't forget. There we go. Now I would like to share a few words about Green Lake Guru, why we put on training sessions. I might ask the speakers if you wouldn't mind muting your microphones just for a minute. I think we're getting some feedback or interference, and then we'll have you take back off here if you are able to mute as well. There we go. Hopefully our interference is getting a little better here. Let's see. There we go. I think we fixed our issue now. There we go. My apologies. To kick us back off, now I'd like to share a few words about Green Lake Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. Improving the quality of life for our customers and their patients is our mission here at Green Lake Guru, likely a very similar mission to many of you that are joining us today. At Green Lake Guru, our focus is on moving medtech forward. That means helping you get your life-changing medical devices to market and keeping them there over time. We know the challenges that medical device companies face in this heavily regulated industry, and our solutions are designed to help streamline your processes so you can navigate the regulatory hurdles and succeed in the market. Green Lake Guru provides medical device companies with industry-leading quality management system and electronic data capture software solutions to scale faster, become more efficient, and reduce risk throughout the product lifecycle. See why 1,100 of the world's leading medtech companies trust Green Lake Guru by heading over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session to see a personalized demo. Today's webinar will focus on key considerations for PMCF compliance under EU MDR. At Green Lake Guru, we built the leading toolbox for post-market clinical data collection and management, specifically designed for medtech operations. Green Lake Guru Clinical is a single compliant platform for collection and management of all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. If you're interested in learning more about this system and how it can help you streamline your post-market activities, you can schedule a demo with us by clicking on the Get EDC Demo button at the top of the screen and following the link in the prompt. Now, let's go ahead and turn our attention over to today's presenter. Gabrielle Feldman has more than 30 years of experience in clinical research. She has been interventional project lead at AMS Advanced Medical Services, GmbH, since 2013, and is currently supervising interventional studies as clinical operations manager with focus on interventional investigations with medical devices. Next, we have Philippe Thiel, who joined Metcon in 2016 and has been focusing on clinical evaluations for 8 years now. Before he worked in pharmaceutical biotechnologies on monoclonal antibodies, he then moved to the medical device industry and gained experience with intercochlear lenses and ophthalmology. Lastly, we have Chris Rush, who is a solutions engineer here at Greenlight Guru. Chris is a biomedical engineer and has been in the medical device space for about 13 years. He spent a number of those years managing clinical studies for Class 3 devices in pivotal studies, PMA studies, and post-market registries. Now at Greenlight Guru, he showcases the value of our clinical data capture software to prospects. Okay, now everything that you've been waiting for today in the featured content, it is my pleasure to hand it over to our presenters so that they can take it away.
Yeah, hello from my side to everybody. Thank you for the kind introduction. The first part will be about the PMCF plan, and just a slide about the company I'm working with. It's called Meticon. We're in Germany, and Meticon can support you for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics throughout the whole product life cycle if you want. So feel free to contact us. So my part is to help you understanding what a robust PMCF plan is. PMCF means post-market clinical follow-up. So post-market clinical follow-up is about clinical data. And since the regulations changed, we have much stronger emphasis on clinical data. We need sufficient data for safety, for performance, for acceptability of the side effects, and eventually for the acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio. So this might sound like a work-intensive, expensive burden, but keep in mind there are also some advantages. For instance, you can feed marketing, and it allows you for further strategic decisions. So clinical data must be evaluated if you want to enter the market, and this must be documented by the clinical evaluation. A clinical evaluation is mandatory for all risk classes, including risk class 1. And after entering the market, you have to keep the clinical evaluation up to date by continuously collecting and evaluating the clinical data. That's what's called post-market clinical follow-up. And this will eventually result in an updated clinical evaluation report. So the medical device regulation wants PMCF to confirm the safety and performance and benefit. You have to monitor identified side effects and contraindications to ensure continued acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio. And you have to do this throughout the expected lifetime of the device. And you have to keep your eyes open for anything that's new that you haven't known before, like emergent risks, new side effects, or any kind of misuse, off-label use. So the documentation for this. If you want the CE mark, you need a proper documentation. And we'll start on the left side, which is the pre-market side. So you have a clinical evaluation plan, which basically tells you what needs to be analyzed. So these are the aspects of benefit, performance, safety that you have identified based on the state of the art. Then you have to create the plans, like for instance, a clinical investigation protocol or a literature search plan. This tells you how to collect the data. This, of course, eventually results in a report accordingly. You have a clinical investigation report or a literature search report, which contains the data that you have collected. And the CER now does the evaluation, which means in the pre-market phase, you compare the data for your device compared to the data in the SOTA, and you can conclude about the acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio and eventually about conformity to the medical device regulation. Now, PMCF tells on the right side when you receive the CE mark and we're on the post market, the PMCF plan again tells you how to collect the data. And as a matter of fact, you have to set up a PMCF plan to get the CE mark. So you have to create that before entering the market so that you can immediately start your activities. The PMCF report then contains the data, and this leads to an update of your clinical evaluation report, where you now compare the updated data to the updated state-of-the-art and conclude about the continued acceptability of all the risks, benefit-risk ratio, and the conformity. And you have to understand PMCF plan to be like an umbrella plan. So if you have several PMCF activities, you will then have for each activity a detailed, exact plan protocol how to do them, and the PMCF plan describes them all. PMCF lasts until the last piece placed on the market. So after that, you're not manufacturing anymore, and therefore you're not able to change the design anymore. So you can then write your last PMCF report, do your last CER update. The post-market surveillance, the PMS, of course, goes on. And a note on the plans, it looks like they're not changing anymore, but if you have a good plan, it doesn't need to be changed anymore. But of course, during the PMCF phase, you might adapt the PMCF activities, add one, or after years, you might cancel some. So the PMCF plan, of course, can change. A quick side view on the related documentation. So the PMCF report is also needed for PMS to do their reportings, and the CER update and the PMCF report both enter also risk management for their risk analysis updates. In that diagram, we show you the order in which the order in which each document should be written, so you have a smooth and logical workflow. If you want to know more about this product life cycle, please feel free to read our blog. It shows you in blue the pre-market phase, and then in orange the post-market phase. Okay, so setting up the PMCF plan. And we want to set up a robust PMCF plan. That means it is compliant, it is efficient in data generation, and of course it's effective compared to the costs involved. So a robust PMCF plan relies on the data that you have generated hitherto. And so we will have a closer look on what's actually contained in the clinical evaluation. And we'll do this using an example, an intraocular lens. The CEP, the clinical evaluation plan, as I told you, tells you basically what needs to be analyzed. So it contains all the parameters that must be addressed. These parameters are identified by the SOTA. And for example, we have, for benefit, of course, the benefit of an intraocular lens is the visual acuity that is restored or improved. A parameter for performance might be the positional stability of that lens in the eye, in the capsular bag. And parameters for safety, well, safety, we're talking about risks. The parameter for risk, per definition, is always severity and frequency of the harms that can happen. And here are some examples. So the capsular bag in which the IOL is placed might be ruptured. There might be a chance of infection, like in every surgery. And more specifically, there might be something called posterior capsular opacification, which is an opacification of the lens because there's a cell layer growing on it with time. So the plans, the protocols, the clinical investigation protocol describes the exact activity to generate this data. And this can be, for example, for the benefit parameter, visual acuity, can be a Snellen chart, right? That's this chart with getting letters smaller and smaller and smaller, and you have to read them with or without glasses. The performance parameter stability can be screened by an ophthalmoscope or measured by an OCT. And the method to collect safety data is, of course, observing and documenting everything that happens. You do this during the surgery and, of course, during the follow-up time. The clinical investigation report then contains the actual data, contains the numbers for your parameters that you want to have. And these are then, of course, the Snellen values, or if you use other charts that might be called logMAR. The stability might be expressed in degrees or in XY translation. And the parameters for safety, as I said, it's always severity and frequency. So you have to calculate the frequency of what you have observed. And you have to measure the severity. For this, usually there are scales in the state of the art. So, for example, you would measure pain using the VAS, Visual Analogous Score, or there is a more general classification of adverse events by Clavian-Dindo and so on. So that's a good way to measure them. And then in the report, you compare the actual data, as I said, against the other, against the state of the art. That's the analysis. And these are just example numbers. So you did a study and you measured a visual acuity of 25, which is slightly better than the SOTA. Your stability is exactly the same as it is expected by the professionals out there in the SOTA, state of the art. For risks, you have an acceptable rate of ruptures, a very good rate of infection. And then for PCO, the opacification, you have some value in the 3 months of follow-up that you did in your study, which looks good, but 3 months is a bit short. As we know from the state of the art, PCO can develop within the next 2 to 5 years. It's a typical long-term risk. And although you have a good initial value and an extrapolation of the data, don't show any signs of worries, yet the follow-up time is too small. And we recognized a limited data set here, which will tell us to create an activity in the PMCF phase to collect further PCO data. There we go. So remember, the MDR tells us to confirm safety performance benefit throughout the expected lifetime of the device. That means our PMCF activity is created to collect PCO data for the entire lifetime of the intraocular lens. In that example, the lifetime of the intraocular lens is a bit unlucky because that's lifelong. You keep it in the eye as long as you live. There are devices, other devices with a more definite lifetime, like single-use instruments, right? They have a shelf life of sterility, or defibrillators have to be replaced after 10 years, and so on. In our case, we know that from the state of the art, that PCO can occur within the next 5 years. So that would be my timeline for that PMCF activity. I said this is a limited data set. There are other types of limited data sets that needs a PMCF activity. For example, you have mean values with still a rather large confidence interval, or that are based on a rather low number of patients, or you have collected some data from the literature and the papers. They are well not of sufficient quality that you could trust them entirely, but yet you have at least sufficient proof. Sufficient means you can argue for that, you can reasonably assume that, and sufficient proof is mandatory and sufficient for the CE mark. And everything will then go into the PMCF activities. The PMCF activities shall solidify the clinical data and conclusions that you have drawn. So to wrap up this in the form of a diagram, we start with sufficient clinical evidence that we need for the CE mark. And we set up a PMCF plan A to keep the entire clinical evaluation up to date. And maybe we have to add further activities according to the identified needs, limited data sets. When we are entering the market, All the clinical aspects of performance, safety, benefit, they have been positively evaluated. And now PMCF emphasizes the application of your device in the real world. So away from data generation in defined settings. And you will have to update your clinical evaluation with data from your device, not from the equivalent anymore. And you do this for the entire life cycle of the device lifetime. And that's where we want to go. So the iterations of updates by PMCF will eventually turn the initially sufficient data into a more complete set of data for the entire product's lifetime. That's the meaning of PMCF. Of course, PMCF doesn't stop there. You always have to keep your eyes open, as I said, for yet unidentified risks, for misuse, and PMCF accompanies the whole life cycle of the device after entering the market until the last piece has been sold. If we look, so that's where we want to go, from sufficient clinical data to complete lifetime clinical evidence. If we look at legacy devices, here the PMCF activities aim at providing clinical data as they are now required by MDR. And you might have to now generate PMCF activities because, for example, you have used only equivalent data. So even the old BEDEF 2.12.2, which is now 12 years old, mentions this. You would need PMCF activities then. Or it can happen that the equivalent data that you have in the clinical evaluation may not be used anymore. So this can happen especially for class 3 devices and implants. Or more simply, MDR tells that data must be from published sources, and unpublished sources are not allowed anymore, and they must be from peer-reviewed journals. Or maybe you do have sufficient data over lifetime, but that data is maybe not strong enough for all the parameters that you need to address, and maybe you were a bit lucky with your reviewer so far. So that's the legacy device situation. And of course, you always have some general PMCF activities for a general update. So as a summary, how to create a robust and effective PMCF. You have to do a regular update of the clinical evaluation. You might identify limited data sets by that clinical evaluation. These need to be expanded by PMCF. And the important thing is that the endpoints that you need to address in those activities, they have already been worked out in your clinical evaluation. They have actually already been worked out in the CE plan. And with that, you can create a PMCF plan. You translate those activities, the need, into an activity that generates exactly the kind of data that you need. And you have several possibilities for PMCF activities, like you would always continue a literature search. You can collect user feedback, or you can more directly address your users by a survey. You can participate or initiate registries. If you have a clinical investigation for the CE mark and it's still running, you might extend the follow-up time, or you can use the data for some retrospective analysis. And of course, if needed, you can initiate a new clinical investigation. So Meticon can help you with the clinical evaluation and to identify the need of PMCF activities with clear endpoints. And with that, you can go, for example, to AMS, and they will tell you how to continue from there. And Dr. Feldman will tell you more about this in a minute. So these are your take-home messages. To set up an effective PMCF plan, the clinical evaluation of safety, performance, and benefit must always be regularly updated with new clinical data from the use of your device by means of permanent proactive PMCF activities. The clinical evaluation might identify limited data sets, and then for those, you would create tailored PMCF activities and add them to the plan. And the clinical evaluation knows the exact parameters addressed in those data sets and you can convert them into clear and precise endpoints for the PMCF activities. You have a variety of activities that are possible, but take care to design them properly. And this we will hear about next. And with that said, I'm handing over the virtual microphone.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thanks to Greenlight Guru to give us the opportunity to share our experience with PMCF studies. We are AMS, Advanced Medical Services, GmbH. We are a full service CRO. That means a full service clinical research organization with headquarters in Germany, in Mannheim, in London, and also in the US in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And over the past 27 years, AMS has become a leading European service provider in the fields of clinical research, but also market access, added value, the whole HTA business, and marketing and sales. And for you today, of course, our experience in clinical research is most interesting. AMS is performing all kinds of clinical studies for both drugs and medical devices. We do interventional and non-interventional studies. So in the fields of medical devices, this would be clinical investigations and PMCF studies. My name is Gabi Feldman. I've worked for AMS since 10 years, and I'm in the business since more than 30 years. Currently, I'm in the function of a clinical operations manager and thus overseeing all the medical device studies that are currently run at AMS, both interventional and non-interventional studies. And as you certainly already know, PMCF is part of the quality and risk management. So PMCF studies here, they are part of the PMCF activities and as such part of the post-market surveillance together with vigilance activities. Pre-CE marking, you do clinical investigations and clinical evaluation, and both clinical investigations and PMCF studies contribute to a full picture of risks and by thus contribute to risk management and overall to quality management. And Philip already mentioned that there are several PMCF activities. These are very general PMCF activities, for example, the spontaneous feedback from the users or requested feedbacks on single cases. But these data are of rather low scientific validity. This depends a little bit on the source. Who reports? Is it the patient or is it the physician? Is it the pharmacist? So the feedback that you might receive from the users might be rather subjective. And of course, as Philip already mentioned, you screen through the scientific publications, and these are freely available documents for either your own or similar products. But you know that the MDR really limited the possibilities to refer to equivalent products. So screening scientific publications is less costly, of course, compared to studies, but you might have a very limited access to the raw data. And if you look into the EU MDR, the Medical Device Regulation, Annex 14, there, and I quote now, it is described, it shall be clearly demonstrated that manufacturers have sufficient levels of access to the data relating to the devices with which they are claiming equivalence in order to justify their claims of equivalence. So in order to comply with this requirement, mostly specific PMCF activities need to be amended or need to be added. And thus you can produce data sets that are for application that are applicable for scientific, that means statistical methods. So this brings us to the more specific PMCF activities, registries or surveys. And registries can be product specific, they can be disease specific. And manufacturers' registries very often are product specific, of course. The manufacturer defines in advance the parameters and data they want to collect and analyze. So they create quite harmonized data, harmonized in qualitative and quantitative sense. And these registries allow collection of longitudinal data. That means you can follow a patient over a long period. But of course, to then at the end to receive long-term data, you will certainly be patient and have enough time for long-term follow-up. Third-party registries are maintained by private or public organizations, institutions, governmental bodies. They are quite commonly used for high-risk class devices. Yes, and they are maintained mostly on disease level. These registries really deliver valuable information on the application and clinical outcomes, but they are not available for all indications and not in each country. So this might be a limitation. And if you look into the European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, you see that the GDPR limits the access to the data. So you have only access to totally anonymized data, or you need to have a patient's informed consent to be able to use these data. So the data quality might be rather uneven in these registries. They might be incomplete or unstructured. It depends a little bit on the sources who feed into these registries. But what you can also do is that you make a systematic survey of patients or users, end users. These are planned surveys, and patients can use, for example, electronic tools for patient-reported outcomes, or you also provide questionnaires to the users in electronic form on paper. This results in rather rapid results. These surveys are not as costly as PMCF studies, but you might have only a limited access to end users, especially in the case of low risk class products where no physician is in between. Then it might be difficult to get access to the patients, to the end users. And what is also a big challenge for these surveys, you need to have very standardized terms to be collected. That means you should ask your questions by multiple choice questions, or you need to code the terms that the end users or patients use in the end. So this is a little bit of a disadvantage of this kind of activity, PMCF activity. What has a more or a higher scientific value are prospective or also retrospective studies, PMCF studies or post-market interventional clinical investigations. So what is the difference? PMCF studies are studies that are, of course, conducted after the device has been placed on the market and the device already bears the CE mark. And with these CE mark products, you can also do interventional studies. For example, by adding some additional, not standard assessments, collecting additional lab samples, collecting biopsies, and so on. So then this is a post-market investigation, but it is still, or it is interventional because it causes additional burdensome or invasive measures. But both types of studies are designed for research. That means you really receive the data quality that you want to have. Of course, they cause higher costs, but the data quality is better. If you decide for an interventional clinical investigation, then there are also higher regulatory obligations. I will explain that later on into more details. And of course, what happens also is that an investigator, an interested physician, initiates a study. These studies then are not done in your systematic clinical evaluation plan or PMCF plan, but outside of any processes of the manufacturer. These studies are called in the MDR other clinical studies, and they are not covered by the MDR. They are covered by national laws. So if the investigators plan for an IIT, an investigator-initiated study, then you might have little influence on the design and on the endpoints the investigator chooses. And you might also have limited access to the raw data. Sometimes there is a cooperation between investigators who plan an IIT because they ask you for funding or for at least providing the products. And then you might, per contract, have some influence on the data that are collected. So the data quality of these IITs can vary quite a lot. And what we also quite often see is that the GCP standards are not always followed. GCP standards are the standards of good clinical practice. I will explain later on that GCP. So if you look on the post-market study, or on the variety of post-market studies that are done, it is, first of all, you need to distinguish between studies within the intended purpose, within the purpose of the intended use that for which you got the CE mark, or if you change the intended use or want to extend it, then these are no longer PMCF studies. These are then interventional studies that are regulated on a higher level. But if you stay within your intended use, then we can distinguish between studies with burdensome and invasive procedures or without these burdensome or invasive procedures. If you decide for additional burdensome procedures, then of course you need an EC vote, a vote from an ethics committee, a positive vote of an ethics committee, and the competent authorities need to be notified. They at least need to know that there is a study going on in their scope. If you do not have any burdensome or invasive procedures, that means if you work really under real-world conditions, then only national laws apply. And in Germany, for example, the Professional Code of Conduct for Physicians applies. And according to this, you need to seek consultancy with an EC, with an ethics committee. And if you look into the Declaration of Helsinki, I'm sure that every country who follows the Declaration of Helsinki would like to see an EC vote before you start any study in human beings. So what is good clinical practice? There is an international standard, the ISO 14155, and this gives rules for how to plan, how to design, how to conduct, how to capture data, how to analyze the data, and how to report on clinical studies or investigations. And if you have a closer look into the scope of this ISO 14155, then you can see that it applies both to pre- and post-market clinical studies. And this is different from drug studies because ICH in drug studies applies only for before market authorization. Non-interventional studies are not subject to ICH GCP. But for medical devices, it is the same requirement. You need to follow also with PMCF studies these good clinical practices. And I tried to summarize here the most important principles for good clinical practice. And I just want to go through that quite quickly. You need to follow the Declaration of Helsinki. It's a declaration of the world's medical associations, and each physician will follow this Declaration of Helsinki. So the anticipated benefits must justify the risk of this investigation. The rights, the safety and well-being of human subjects always prevail over the interests of science and society. And then if you go into the practical rules that they give, you need to have a clinical investigation plan, a SIP, a kind of protocol, where you in advance define what you want to do. And this SIP is then approved by an ethics committee. And for certain studies, you also will need an approval or at least a non-objection from your competent authority. So this must be in place. And this is why you should not deviate from the clinical investigation plan unless the safety of your patient is at risk. And these studies can only be performed by qualified healthcare professional. This applies both to the physicians who perform and who treat the patients, but also the staff at sponsor, at the manufacturer who does or who organizes this study. And then, of course, as I already mentioned, you need to obey the data protection rules. So the patients must give their written informed consent to the use of their data unless you use completely anonymous data. And these data must be recorded, handled, and securely stored in a way that allows accurate reporting, interpretation, monitoring, auditing, and verification. So the data you create at any time must be verifiable and must be auditable. And this is your task as a sponsor of a study, that you need to have the oversight on the conduct of your study. You do that by monitoring the study, either by centralized monitoring of accumulated data or by sending clinical research associates to the sites where the study is performed and have the data and the source data especially verified. Confidentiality of records, of course, has to be kept all over the study and also after the study. It is always recommended to use systems, to implement systems to ensure the quality of every aspect of the study. That can be quality management systems, risk management systems, but also electronic tools to keep an oversight over your study. Trial master files, clinical trial management systems, EDC systems to capture the data. So you need to have a systematic approach to every aspect of your study. How to plan a PMCF study? As Philip said, you need to carefully develop the PMCF plan. And you need to very strongly focus on the clinical data that are really needed. There might be gaps identified during clinical evaluation and during writing of the PMCF plan. And then you need to thoroughly plan how to get these clinical data to close the gaps. Choose the appropriate study design. It's not always a randomized clinical trial that is needed. Sometimes observational studies or registries or maybe also single cohort studies can be sufficient to do your study. You thoroughly plan the objectives and the endpoints because you need to think about how to prove safety, how to prove performance, how to close the gaps, which effects do I want to show. And then it is most recommendable to ask a biostatistician to calculate the sample size depending on the primary objective and the planned statistical method for analysis. If you expect a rather significant effect of your product, then a small sample size might be enough. If you do not know the effects that your product might have, then you should do probably a pilot study in a very limited sample size. And from this experience, then you can calculate a better or a more extensive study with a profound sample size calculation. What our experience is that if you plan for a PMCF study, you should choose the right country and the right site. And I apologize if there are Italian colleagues in the audience, but we have made recent experience in Italy. If you do a non-interventional PMCF study in Italy, there are no timelines the ECs need to follow. There are no timelines authorities demand, and you have to apply not within a central approval process, but for each ethics committee separately. So this takes quite a long time. Spain is much quicker in approving PMCF studies. France, in Germany, there's also a streamlining of the process. So you need to carefully choose the country where you want to run the PMCF study. And then you need to choose the right site. The most frequent problem that you face when performing a PMCF study is that the recruitment rate that you expected is not met. So you carefully need to screen at the sites. Do they have the patients you want to have? Probably you need to pre-screen the patient pool the sites have. Is the site well equipped? And also a problem very often is, does the site have sufficient capacities, especially for documentation of study data? This takes longer than most people estimate. The site has to have qualified staff, of course. They should be experienced in clinical investigations. And when you plan a PMCF study, you should be aware of the duration of the study and of the costs, because the longer a study, the more expensive the study is. So realistically plan time for all the steps for the approval process, not only for patient recruitment and patient treatment, but also for evaluation of the data. This has a significant impact on the study costs, and this is why we at the CRO are very often pressed to do a quick submission, to get started very quickly, and then at the end to evaluate very quickly. And patient recruitment is also very often a topic which might prolong a study, as I already said. And you as the manufacturer should analyze your own capacities and competencies in your company very honestly. And if needed, if you do not have the capacities, early involve consultants or even very early a CRO, and plan for outsourcing of your services. So if you look at the tasks that are done within a study, a clinical study, then it is a kind of puzzle. There are a lot of activities, a lot of people involved in planning and evaluating a study until the report is final. First of all, these are the clinical operations people who do the project management, who coordinate the different people involved. Biostats, they come into the game very early because they need to calculate sample sizes. CROs are also able to provide medical advice. CROs are able to perform quality management together with you. CROs offer data management services. They coordinate, they process the data so that the biostatisticians can evaluate the studies statistically. CROs very often employ also medical writers. These are the persons who are experienced in writing CIPs, these clinical investigational plans or protocols. They are also very experienced in writing the report of a study. Of course, a CRO can support in vigilance activities or in clinical safety activities and regulatory affairs. Very often we are really asked to submit the studies because the sponsor does not, this is not a daily business for the sponsor. and this CRO can really support you by their experience. What kind of documents do you need to submit? How should the documents look like? Where are the pitfalls? So there is a good consultancy really important. And of course, a CRO can provide all the clinical systems you might need, an electronic trial master file, a clinical trial management system, an electronic data capturing system, and so on. So it is a big puzzle, and you can decide to only outsource single pieces of this puzzle, but a full service CRO as AMS can cover all these services that are needed. And yes, while I talked about data management and EDC systems, this is the topic of Chris, Greenlight Guru Office here for quality management and electronic data capturing their systems. So I would like to hand over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Gabby. Excellent. Yeah, so let's jump right into it here. I've got some slides that I'm going to move through here relatively quickly. And then I've got some software previews here. We'll try and keep this portion of the presentation relatively brief so we can ensure we can get to Q&A. So we talked about general PMCF activities, specific PMCF activities. This second bullet point, specific activities, investigator-initiated trials, registries, etc. PMCF, HCP, I'd like to spell out all these acronyms, healthcare professional surveys. Not sure if that was a new acronym here, but all of these different types of specific activities we'll focus on from the data capture, electronic data capture specifically, so software tools that can help with this. Firstly, and I hear maybe some background noise. Gabby, if you're able to mute, it might possibly be one of the speakers. That sounds better. In terms of the data capture tools that you're assessing for conducting your clinical activities and gathering the data, you want to make sure that these electronic data capture tools are facilitating compliance with all of those standards and regulations that Gabby and Philippe have talked about earlier. So from the data capture software system, it needs to facilitate compliance with ISO 14155. Essentially, that means the systems need to be validated. The software tool needs to be validated to ensure that it can do all of these things listed here every time consistently, reliably, that the system is secure, and really having all of this built into the platform so you as the sponsor don't have to worry about the software tool being used to capture data being compliant. It should all be built in. Not just 14155, but also the standards that we see here. These software tools should have this all built in there. So from the IVD's perspective, ISO 20916, ICH GCP, having a system that's Part 11 compliant to capture electronic signature for e-consent, and of course, facilitating compliance with the EU GDPR and HIPAA regulations as well. Really important to have these built into your systems. We do have a out-of-the-box tool here with Greenlight Guru. Feel free to check us out more. You're hearing a little bit about us today. You'll see the software a little bit, but it is a single compliant platform to capture all of your data for clinical activities, pre-market and post-market. Feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to breeze through some of these slides here. This has been summarized well by the previous speakers, but just to highlight here, I'm going to show in the platform a very basic structure that reflects these different types of studies. And I've got these bunched, grouped, and this is probably, they're not certainly identical, but just the structure of these different types of studies: full-blown clinical investigations, registries, investigator-initiated studies. Typically, these are going to follow more of your traditional clinical study structure. Screening, inclusion, exclusion, long-term follow-up, very common for class 3 types of devices. Again, I won't rehash all of the information that was shared previously. Physician surveys or case reports, these can fill gaps in the data. These are typically surveys that are completed by physicians. These are really beneficial for shorter-term follow-up types of devices, so something with 60 to 90 days, indwell in the body, that sort of thing. I'll show you an example of a physician survey study in Greenlight Guru Clinical, so how that can be represented in an electronic data capture tool. And then also, I'll skip this. We're gonna actually look at the system here today. So let's take a look at the next type of study: patient survey studies. These obviously are only possible if you do have direct access to subjects, and again, not ideal for all device classes. And Gabby mentioned this before, patient surveys, they really need to be very simple. So optimized for a lay person completing surveys. And let's jump into the system here at this point. So let me stop sharing this. I'm going to do relatively quickly here, just for the time remaining. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Let's take a quick look at Greenlight Guru Clinical. I'll give you a couple previews of some study designs. So this is the landing page. I'm clicking into a study that has a more traditional study design. So think full-blown clinical investigation, investigator-initiated study, long-term or post-market registries with long-term follow-ups. We have subjects here listed. Each of these data events or boxes has multiple forms, and these represent different time points. So setting up electronic data capture tools for long-term follow-up should be relatively straightforward, as we're seeing here, capturing adverse events, any scheduled visits, concomitant medication. Electronic data capture tools can not only capture the scheduled, anticipated visits, but also unscheduled things like adverse events. There's a lot more to it there, but just for the sake of time, just a preview long-term follow-up types of studies. That's a general structure that those would follow. Case reports, physician surveys, those look a little bit different typically. So here I've got an example of physician surveys. In this setup that I have here, I have the physician surveys broken out by the country in which the physicians are practicing. There are specific URLs associated with each of these sites. So for all of our German physicians, there will be a specific URL for those German, for that particular country. And when they click into that survey, as I'm doing here, it'll bring that physician right into a survey, and they would be able to complete that that survey directly on their smartphone, tablet, desktop computer. Makes no difference here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the completion of that survey. I'll show a quick preview of what a form looks like. But you can lay out studies by country. If you have any distributors that are involved with your device that's on the market, you can set up the system such that distributors have access to the EDC, and they can actually help drive clinician participation in post-market clinical follow-up physician surveys, for instance, and they would have a unique URL associated with their distributor site, and they can have their physicians that they work with complete surveys as well. So it gives you flexibility to collect data from your physicians. I'll give you a quick example from a sponsor perspective. When I click into this German cases here, in this example, these are mock physicians. These are actually Greenlight Guru personnel, but I'm able to see who these physicians are, and I'm able to click in and see their data. For the distributors, I can control my permissions such that when I click into the distributor there, I'm not seeing the physician names. However, the distributor may be seeing those. You can blind certain participants in the platform to see certain aspects of the system. Now let's take a look at an example of a survey itself. So jumping back to our main page, and I'll wrap here in about 30 seconds here. When we're designing surveys within the platform, it's really important, especially for surveys, physician surveys, here's an example, to really put a lot of consideration into the design of the survey itself. So do you need to collect identifiable information, or do you need to ensure that you're not collecting identifiable information, such as patient age, ranges here in this example versus date of birth? Capturing date of birth could be considered identifiable information. Gender, race, those sorts of things. Once you start to stack those on top, they could be considered identifiable. So making sure that you're designing your forms such that you're capturing what you need, but you're not getting too specific. Capturing specific information about your device where you may have additional questions embedded in your form specific to what the indication of the device usage was for. So notice these might be your indicated uses for the device, and you can capture information about off-label usage. Here's an example. These might be your indicated uses here. In this survey, we have an other field where other uses of the device will be captured here. If you were to word this question such as, was the device used off-label? Probably nobody is going to tell you that they did, but you are able, by the design of the survey, to capture that type of information, putting proper thought into the design here, capturing it as an other field rather than asking outright, is this off-label usage? People probably get a little bit squirrely and don't want to answer that question. For the sake of time, I'm going to wrap the portion here and bring it back to the Q&A. But please do reach out to us if you have specific questions about designing surveys, full-blown studies, case reports, etc. So let's jump back over to this main page, and I'll hand it back to Laura here, and I appreciate the time.
Wonderful. Well, I want to be the first to say a big thank you to all of our presenters today. I know I have learned a lot, and I know others have as well. And for our presenters, do you have an extra 3 minutes here just so we can answer a couple of questions that have come in? We have had many questions come in, so I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but if you each have an extra just a few minutes here, we'll see if we can't answer a couple to start, if that works for our presenters.
That works.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pull up our most popular question that we have here. So, is a PMCF necessary for all classes of devices, or can you take a risk-based approach?
So, microphone's on. I take that question. As I said, a clinical evaluation is mandatory for all classes, and it's mandatory to keep it up to date. So yes, PMCF therefore is necessary and mandatory as well. The risk-based approach is an interesting second question. The activities, of course, can be chosen or designed, or the amount of activities by a risk-based approach, or at least the intensity of an activity. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll get another question answered here. What are the considerations for custom-made devices regarding the PMCF?
I've never been in that topic, to be honest. I can't give you an answer by heart to that. Sorry.
No worries. It gives an opportunity to go in and do some more research on some different areas here. So let me go ahead and find another quick question that we can answer here. Here we go. Does the PSUR replace PMS reports, or do we have to write both for a Class 2B device? And should the PMCF data be injected into the PSUR?
Okay, that's for me too, I guess. First part is definition of terms. PMS report is for Class 1 devices, and all the others have a periodic safety update report. The PMS report is a bit smaller and does not need to be updated regularly. So 2B class devices have a PSUR. And the PMCF data, the exact wording in the MDR is that the PSUR or any PMS report have to consider the results from the PMCF activities. They are not mentioning documents, and I suggest that you first write the PMCF report, then the PMS group can take that and refer to it, get the main message out of it, and then write their PSUR. And after that, you write the clinical evaluation report update, because that document has to cite the PSUR. If you want to know more about that order of things, please go on our homepage. The blog that I've presented you will exactly address this.
Wonderful. Well, again, I will say a big thank you, and especially Philippe, since I know all of those questions came your way here, and I'm sorry we're not able to get to all of the questions because there are quite a few questions for everybody throughout, but I know we're running out of time here. So I just want to say a big thank you for the informative presentation and the valuable insights, especially during the Q&A portion. As one final reminder for all of our attendees, today's recording and presentation slides will be sent out to you here in the following days. But otherwise, a large thank you to our presenters for today and for everyone attending our presentation. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all so much.